Joining us now, live from Cairo, Eddie Yeranian, our man in the Middle East, also CBS radio correspondent, longtime voice of America, journalist. Edward Yeranian, good to have you, sir.
My pleasure, John. Thank you for having me. I guess what we wanted to talk about is a subject which is probably not getting a lot of coverage in the media. It should be. Clearly, the public, the American public, doesn't have a good grasp of this issue, and I don't blame them. If you read what the mainstream media puts out, you probably wouldn't get any good sense of what's going on. But it's about Qatar, that little Gulf emirate, and its neighbors, which have broken diplomatic ties with it and surrounded it and closed its borders. Saudi Arabia has a land border with it. It's closed its land, sea, and air borders. And if you look in the media, the U.S. media, they're putting out a lot of red herrings. And I say that as someone who knows what's going on, so I can tell a red herring when I see one. And of course, if I didn't know what was going on, I'd ask myself why. And of course, you've seen this during the election campaign. You've seen this on a lot of key issues. They throw out red herrings on a lot of issues which are very important to our democracy. And on this particular one, it's very important because Qatar gives a lot of money to American politicians, various politicians, to think tanks, to human rights groups. And it's what's coming out in the media is not reflecting what's actually going on. And if you listen to President Trump in his tweet, several tweets saying that Qatar is being accused of terrorism by its neighbors. He ought to know. He was in Saudi Arabia about 2-3 weeks ago for an anti-terrorism summit. His neighbors, including Egyptian President Sisi, undoubtedly posed the issue to him because the U.S. has a major air and Central Command, I believe, base in Qatar called Udaida. And clearly, unless the President Trump gave a green light to this, none of it would have been taking place. And yesterday, of course, if you saw the U.S. media, you'd see quotes like U.S. officials bewildered about this crisis. Now, clearly, President Trump is not bewildered. His tweets indicated that, and he had to have known what was going on because he went to Saudi Arabia, as I said, a couple of weeks ago. So here's the problem. I'm also seeing in the media this morning a former U.S. intelligence director, Mr. Clapper by name, in Australia, saying that the Russian crisis is bigger than Watergate. Well, he can say that out of Australia, but I think this Qatar issue is a lot bigger than the Russian issue. The Russian issue is being played way out of proportion, and this Qatar issue is not getting any play at all. Qatar, if you take money as a politician, I believe this is treason. I haven't looked at my constitution recently, but I believe that taking money from a foreign government is treason. And there are a lot of politicians out there who do. And if this all comes out, the plug of the swamp is going to finally get unplugged.
Okay, Eddie Yeranian, live in Cairo. Let's get to some of the facts here. Number one, CNN yesterday coming out and saying that they had evidence saying that the Russians planted fake news that drove the decisions of our Middle Eastern allies to abandon Qatar, saying that it was all fake news and that the president basically took the bait. What is that about?
I guess you'd have to go and look and see who owns that network these days. It's, if you remember Ted Turner, we all knew, and I don't know if we liked him, but anyway, at least we knew who he was. Today, we don't really know who owns that network, but we do know that several individuals have claimed to own shares in it. We know that Walid bin Talal, the Saudi prince, has claimed to have had shares in the network. I don't know what his position is on this, but clearly it's kind of strange. And we know that George Soros, according to stockholding records, had shares in it at some point within the last few years. I don't know if he still does, but we know that he did at some point very recently. So I'd be looking at who owns this network as to why they'd be putting out that story. I don't think Russia has anything to do with this story. President Trump, as I said, conferred with the U.S. Gulf allies at that summit in Riyadh, that anti-terror summit in Riyadh. And it really had nothing to do with whatever story came out on the Qatari news agency, whether it was true or not. I don't even know if it was hacked, because some sources said the Qatari emir made those comments in private and somebody put them out and made them public. So I don't know whether they were hacked or not. But in any case, the issue was that Qatar is being accused by its neighbors of being a source of terrorism. Now, if you talk to governments in the region, I've heard people, credible sources in Sudan, pointing out that Sudanese terror groups are supported by Qatar. The government has taken money from Qatar. The Ansar Sharia terrorist group in the east of Libya has taken money from Qatar. Boko Haram, according to Arab media, some Gulf media, has taken money from Qatar. The Hamas group in Gaza takes money from Qatar. Hamas controls the border with the Sinai. The Sinai is seething with terrorism. The U.S. media often calls this group Beit al-Maqdis, and then says it's affiliated with the Islamic State group. But of course, no one could go in and out of those tunnels if the Islamic State, if Hamas were not letting them in and out. So it's really irrelevant that it's calling itself Beit al-Maqdis or Islamic State, because Hamas controls the tunnels. And who supports them? Qatar. Qatar pays the bills. The Egyptian media has been all over that story for the last five years, and I don't think there's any question about it. In fact, they even had a conference recently to say that Hamas has changed its charter, which I suspect it hasn't. But in any case, a lot of terror groups in Syria. There were several Islamic militant groups that were fighting outside of Damascus about 8-10 months ago. The Qataris mediated, and Arab media said, well, because Qatar is paying both of them, so of course they would be mediating. So a lot of accusations of terrorism all across the region, at least 6 or 7 countries, Boko Haram, of course, all over Central Africa, so that's even more countries. So this is what the Gulf states are accusing Qatar of. This is what President Trump was accusing Qatar of, and all the rest is a red herring.
So you're convinced, with all the evidence that you've seen, that there's no question that the country of Qatar is sponsoring this terrorism in the Middle East, in Africa, and you think that when the president went to Saudi Arabia, that enough of our allies convinced him what was going on, and he basically nodded to them and said, all right, he would back that in the cutoff. Now, CNN comes on and says, well, that's not true. It's fake news planted by the Russians to disrupt our alliances, which you're saying is asinine. I really never got to the bottom of that last night because I can't get past 10 minutes of CNN, and now it didn't seem to make any sense to me. But remember, this is a country that basically cheated and stole for the soccer championship, right? The World Cup, remember that? They were bribing all of the World Cup people, number one. Number two, they also, remember, they owned a U.S. news outlet called Al Jazeera Network for a very long time that they just shut down. It had a decent audience and not a bad reputation before it went down. I used to have some of their journalists on, like Ali Selshi and people like that. So what you're saying is Trump did the right thing. The Middle Eastern allies that we have, they did the right thing in cutting Qatar off, right? They absolutely did the right thing, but nobody's covering it. Is that the basic gist of what your argument is?
Yes, that they did the right thing. President Trump was in on it. He knew what was going on. And these various media outlets, I don't want to libel them by saying who's taking money from Qatar, but a lot of them you can see are taking money from Qatar quite clearly. It's also been rumored in the Arab and Egyptian media for the last few years, and the names of those media outlets that take money, allegedly take money from Qatar, are also out there. And if you watch how they cover this unfolding crisis, you can clearly see it, at least with one of the wire services. It's painfully obvious when you know what the real facts are and you see what the red herrings they're throwing out. So I'd say Qatar has a very powerful reach. I don't want to criticize their Jazeera America because they had a lot of good journalists on that,
yeah, they did.
network. So that's neither here nor there. But they do have a lot of clout with the American media. They have a lot of clout with American politicians. If you looked at the WikiLeaks, you'd know that the Qatari emir's mother gave money to Bill Clinton for his birthday. I can't remember how many $1 million. We know for a fact that Qatar gives money to other U.S. politicians. I think for several politicians, at least for Bill Clinton's presidential library, I believe that's an established fact. And the other politicians, once again, I don't want to go libeling anyone, but if this all comes out, if the Qatari emir falls, I don't know that he's going to, but if that information all comes out, a lot of U.S. politicians are in big trouble.
So when you say he gave money to politicians, now that's illegal, right? If somebody running for a political office in the United States cannot take money from somebody representing a foreign government, right? That's clearly illegal. So how would they?
I don't know. It depends on how they do it. I mean, if you do it through one of those whatever type PAC organizations, right. I'm not sure exactly what the legal ramifications are. But yes, in general, it is illegal.
So what you're saying is mother can give money to a PAC that gives money to another PAC that then gives money to a politician. So you got to trace it back to its origin for them to buy the influence. So that's what you're saying is Qatar has been trying to buy influence in the United States. They're harboring terrorists. They're fostering terrorism. And finally, our allies in the Middle East said they've had enough. And they've cut them off.
Yes. Clearly, they've had enough. Clearly, they've cut them off. Egypt, I mean, I've been sitting here in Egypt since 2008. I've been watching this unfolding issue because Qatar was supporting the Muslim Brotherhood when it came to power back in 2011. Qatar supported the revolution from the very outset. In fact, the Muslim Brotherhood people broke out of prison, and the first thing they did was telephone Al Jazeera TV. The Mufti of Qatar, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, has issued fatwas, a religious edict saying it's okay to kill Egyptian military and police because he doesn't like their political stance. He goes on Jazeera TV and has a weekly, I believe it's still weekly, religious talk show, and he's on the payroll of Qatar. So they cannot deny that, at the very least. And I guess Egypt has been trying to say this, that Qatar supports terrorism for at least the last 3-4 years, and nobody has been listening. The U.S. media has been distorting the story, saying that Egypt keeps wanting to shut down Al Jazeera TV and threw its journalist in jail, and that this is I can't remember their slogan, that journalism is not a crime. Well, if you tell lies, I think it is. In times of war, telling lies in times of war is a crime. I think Tokyo Rose was convicted of a crime back during World War II.
Yes, she was. And I got to tell you this, I appreciate your analysis here and your live report, Eddie Yeranian, from Cairo today. I got a couple of questions here. Sean in Newport News says, does this have anything to do with Qatar's natural gas?
Yes, Qatar has a lot of money because of a natural gas field which it shares with Iran. Qatar calls it, I believe, the North Dome, and Iran calls it the South Pars field. In fact, the Iranians are upset, at least according to former President Bani Sadr, because they believe that Qatar has been doing vertical drilling and taking gas from the Iranian side. But never mind that. The Qataris are very wealthy. They ship liquid natural gas from a fleet of tankers that they themselves own to Europe. They sell a lot of gas in Britain. They sell a lot of gas in a number of other European countries. And they've been also trying to put a gas pipeline through Syria, which is one of the reasons this Syrian civil war or conflict has been festering for the last, I don't know how many years, I guess since 2011. That's 6 years now. And Qatar, at least according to French media, had offered Syria, Bashar al-Assad, the president, a deal to put their gas pipeline through, and he refused because he's an ally of Iran. And as I said, Iran controls the northern part of that same gas field. Okay,
this is from Dr. Joe in Northern Virginia. He says, remember, Al Gore sold current TV to Al Jazeera, received about $200 million of the $500 million sale price. And Ken in Chesapeake says, how are the American politicians going to get in trouble over Qatar when Hillary Clinton is still walking around and not in jail? Ken from Chesapeake.
Well, that's the problem. You see, the media doesn't want to cover these subjects. Anything that is not pleasant, anything that puts certain political parties or certain politicians in a bad light are not covered. They ignore them. I heard your own one of your guests say that voter fraud in Virginia was impressive. I don't know how many thousand your people voted illegally in Virginia. No one is talking about that issue. Nobody is talking about a lot of issues that are very important. I mean, a lot of illegals voted across the country during the presidential election. That's a major issue, but nobody is talking about it. So here, there are a lot of things that don't get talked about, and perhaps you're the only one that wants to listen to me. And here I have been a CBS radio correspondent for how many years, and nobody wants to listen to this story. So if you're putting it out there, please listen. Tell your friends. It's important. It's a very true story, and if you don't hear it on the networks, a lot of these networks are taking money from Qatar, and they don't want to put this story out there.
Well, Edward, that's why we're here. And I appreciate your enthusiasm today and everything you've done. And let's be sure that we keep following this up. We have you on a regular basis. I know sometimes we get ahead of ourselves with some of the other stuff going on, but the reason that a network like ours exists, the reason why I get up every day at 3:15 a.m. is to be able to have a platform to get people like yourself on to get the truth out to the American people. Because like you said, you've been with CBS for I don't know how long, and they blow this story off. I mean, it's unbelievable, Ed. Thanks for being with us. We're going to follow up on a great analysis today. Eddie Yeranian, our man in the Middle East, live from Cairo.